April 14th, 1851, Baltimore, Maryland, Camden Street Slave Market. A man stands on an auction platform in the cold spring rain. His hands are bound. His left eye is swollen shut, the bruising spreading across his cheekbone in shades of purple and black. His lips are cracked and bleeding. But it is not the visible injuries that make the crowd uncomfortable. It is his silence. Most slaves on the auction block display fear or resignation or anger. This man displays nothing. He stares at a point somewhere above the crowd's heads, his one good eye fixed on something no one else can see. His breathing is steady. His posture, despite the rope burns on his wrists and the obvious malnutrition that has left his frame gaunt, remains somehow dignified. The auctioneer, a man named Tobias Creel, who had conducted slave sales in Baltimore for 17 years, holds the bill of sale with visible distaste. He does not want to conduct this auction. The circumstances are irregular. The price is insulting. But business is business, and the man who ordered this sale, Charles Whitfield, is not someone you refuse. "We begin the bidding," Creel announces, his voice carrying across the sparse crowd of 20 or so buyers who have gathered despite the weather. "At $9. $9. The crowd murmurs. $9 is less than the cost of a decent pair of boots, less than a barrel of flour, less than a laying hen and her eggs for a month. $9 is not a price you pay for human property, even damaged human property. It is a price that suggests something else entirely. It suggests revenge." The man on the platform does not react to the price. He continues staring at that invisible point, his jaw set, his breathing controlled. If he feels humiliation or rage or despair, he does not show it. And somehow that restraint, that absolute refusal to give his tormentors the satisfaction of his pain, makes the moment even more unbearable to witness. $9, Creel repeats. "Do I have a bid?" The crowd shifts. No one raises a hand. Buying a slave at this price would be participating in whatever personal vendetta motivated the sale. It would be taking sides in a dispute most of them know nothing about. It would be, in some indefinable way, shameful. But there is always someone willing to profit from another man's shame. $9, a voice calls from the back. The speaker is a plantation overseer from southern Maryland, a man known for buying damaged slaves cheap and working them to death in tobacco fields where no one asks questions about mortality rates. Creel nods. $9. Do I hear? $10. The second voice belongs to a woman. She stands near the front, her clothing marking her as Quaker, plain dress, simple bonnet, no ornamentation. Her face is weathered, her eyes sharp. She is perhaps 50 years old, and there is something in her bearing that suggests she has not come here by accident. The overseer turns to look at her, calculating whether this is worth pursuing. $1 is $1. He could let it go. But he does not. $11, he says. $15, the Quaker woman replies without hesitation. Now the crowd is paying attention. Whatever is happening here has stopped being about property acquisition and become something else, a contest, a statement. The overseer hesitates. $15 is still below market value for a healthy male slave, but it is also 3 times what he had expected to pay. He looks at the man on the platform, trying to assess whether this is worth the investment. The man finally moves. His gaze shifts from that invisible point and locks on the overseer. For 3 seconds they stare at each other. The overseer's expression does not change. He does not speak. But something passes between them, some communication that transcends words. The overseer steps back. He will not bid again. 15 once? 15 twice? He pauses, waiting for any final bids. None come. Sold to the lady for $15. The Quaker woman approaches the platform. She counts out $15 in mixed coins and bills, placing them in Creel's hand. He prepares the bill of sale, filling in the details with practiced efficiency. At the bottom, in the space marked Buyer, the woman signs her name in clear script, Rebecca Claiborne. When she takes the rope binding the man's wrists, her touch is gentle. She unties the knot with care, as though removing chains from something fragile and valuable. The man's hands come free. He flexes his fingers slowly, circulation returning. "Can you walk?" Rebecca Claiborne asked quietly. The man nodded. "Then come with me. You are safe now." They leave the auction house together, walking into the rain. And as they disappear into Baltimore's crowded streets, no one in that room understands what has just occurred. No one realizes that the man sold for $9 possesses knowledge that will help dismantle slavery's infrastructure across 3 states. No one knows that his mathematical genius, the very thing that made him damaged goods in the eyes of his former master, will make him invaluable to the people fighting to end the institution that tried to destroy him. This is his story, and every word of it is true. His name was Solomon. At least that was the name recorded in Charles Whitfield's property ledger when he was born in 1829 on Charles Whitfield Manor, a tobacco plantation 20 miles south of Baltimore. His mother, a woman named Dinah, who worked as a house servant, never told him his African name. She died when he was 6 from pneumonia that went untreated because the plantation doctor was attending to a white overseer's injured horse. But before she died, Dinah did something that would change Solomon's life in ways she could not have anticipated. She taught him to count. Not the simple counting that most children learn, 1, 2, 3. Dinah taught Solomon to count everything. How many steps from the slave quarters to the main house? How many seconds between lightning and thunder? How many treads in the hem of a shirt? How many beans in a cup? How many cups in a bushel? How many bushels the plantation produced each season? Numbers, she told him, are the only truth white men cannot change with their words. You remember that. After Dinah died, Solomon was transferred to work in the stables. He was 7 years old, small for his age, useful for crawling into tight spaces to clean tack and retrieve dropped tools. The head groom, an enslaved man named Joseph, who had been on Whitfield Manor for 30 years, took responsibility for the boy. Joseph was the closest thing to a father Solomon would ever know. It was Joseph who noticed that Solomon could calculate measurements without tools, could look at a pile of hay and estimate its weight within 5 pounds, could hear the number of hoofbeats and identify which horse was being ridden before it came into view, could keep track of complex feed schedules for 20 horses without writing anything down. "You have a gift," Joseph told him, "but you need to be careful with it. White folks don't like slaves who are too smart, makes them nervous." Solomon tried to hide his abilities, but he was 8 years old, and 8-year-old boys are not skilled at concealment. When Charles Whitfield's son, Benjamin, who was Solomon's age, came to the stables for riding lessons, he noticed that Solomon could calculate distances and speeds without hesitation. Benjamin was fascinated. He began asking Solomon questions, mathematical puzzles that Benjamin's tutor had assigned. Solomon would solve them in his head, often faster than Benjamin could explain them. This became a game between the two boys, a private competition that Benjamin found thrilling and Solomon found dangerous. But it was Benjamin's tutor, a man named Cornelius Harper, who changed everything. Harper was a Harvard-educated mathematician who had taken the position at Whitfield Manor because he was a drunk and Harvard had quietly suggested he find employment elsewhere. He was brilliant and bitter and perpetually intoxicated, and he cared about mathematics more than he cared about social convention. When Benjamin mentioned Solomon's abilities, Harper didn't believe it. No slave child could solve advanced arithmetic. It was impossible. But Harper was also a scientist, and scientists test their hypotheses. He came to the stables one afternoon in the summer of 1838. Solomon was 9 years old, mucking out stalls. Harper approached him with a slate and chalk. "Boy, can you read numbers?" Solomon looked at Joseph, who gave a slight shake of his head, a warning, "Be careful." "Yes, sir."
Harper wrote on the slate, 47 times 23. "What is this?" Solomon stared at the numbers. He knew this was a test, knew that the right answer might be as dangerous as the wrong one. But numbers were truth, and his mother had taught him to value truth above safety. 1,081, sir." Harper's expression did not change. He erased the slate and wrote 156 divided by 12. 13, sir." Another equation, 89 plus 734 minus 291. 532, sir. Solomon stared at Harper for a long moment. Then he did something unprecedented. He began teaching him. For the next 3 years, Cornelius Harper conducted an illegal experiment in human potential. Every afternoon, while Charles Whitfield believed his son was receiving private instruction, Harper spent half his time teaching Solomon mathematics, geometry, basic physics, astronomy. Solomon learned to read and write with fluency that would have been shocking in a free black child, much less an enslaved one. Harper kept detailed notes on Solomon's progress. He wrote letters to colleagues at Harvard and Princeton describing a natural mathematical prodigy without mentioning that his subject was enslaved. He became obsessed with the question of whether genius was inherent or cultivated, whether Solomon's abilities proved something profound about human potential regardless of race. But Harper was also drunk most of the time, and drunk men make mistakes. In December of 1841, Harper left his notes in the library where Charles Whitfield found them. The notes described Solomon's education in detail, described the books Harper had given him, described Solomon's ability to solve equations that challenged university students. Charles Whitfield was not an ignorant man. He understood immediately what this meant. An educated slave was a dangerous slave. An educated slave who could read, write, and calculate was a slave who might read abolitionist newspapers, who might calculate routes to freedom, who might teach others. Whitfield confronted Harper that evening. The conversation was brief and brutal. Harper was given 2 hours to pack his belongings and leave the property. He was told that if he ever spoke about Solomon to anyone, Whitfield would ensure he never worked as a tutor again. Harper left. Solomon never saw him again. But the knowledge Harper had given him remained, and Charles Whitfield had to decide what to do with a 12-year-old slave who could read, write, and perform mathematics that most white men could not. He made a calculated decision. He would use Solomon's abilities for profit. For the next 9 years, Solomon worked as Whitfield's personal accountant. He managed the plantation's books, calculated crop yields and profit margins, tracked expenses and revenues. He was given a small room in the main house, better food than the other slaves, access to the ledgers and records that documented every financial transaction on Whitfield Manor. He was, by the standards of enslaved people, privileged. But privilege is not freedom. And Solomon understood something that Charles Whitfield did not. Every number he recorded was also evidence, evidence of how much wealth was extracted from enslaved labor, evidence of the economic calculations that treated human beings as depreciable assets, evidence that could be used someday by someone to prove exactly how the system worked. Solomon began keeping a second set of books, hidden books. books that documented everything Whitefield would never want documented. And in 1851, Charles Whitefield discovered them. March 29, 1851. Solomon was 21 years old. He had been working in the plantation office since dawn, reconciling the previous quarter's accounts. The tobacco harvest had been exceptional, profits were up 37%, and Whitefield was in an expansive mood. He had been drinking since breakfast, celebrating with his overseer and his son Benjamin, who was now 21, and being groomed to take over the plantation. Solomon heard them before they entered the office, heard the heavy footsteps, the slurred laughter, the aggressive confidence that comes from liquor and power combined. "Solomon," Whitefield said. His voice was pleasant, but there was something beneath it, something cold. "I need you to explain something to me." Solomon stood. Protocol required it when white men entered a room. "Yes, sir?" "I was reviewing the storage room inventory this morning, found something interesting behind the old ledgers from 1840. Whitefield reached into his coat and withdrew a slim journal bound in cheap leather. "Found this." Solomon's chest tightened. The journal was one of his, one of the hidden records he had kept for 4 years, documenting things that would never appear in Whitefield's official books. "Open it," Whitefield commanded. Benjamin moved to the desk, flipped through pages. His expression changed as he read, changed from curiosity to confusion to anger. "Father, this is—" Benjamin looked at Solomon. "This is treason." Solomon said nothing. There was nothing to say. The journal contained calculations that no slave was supposed to make, calculations of exactly how much value each enslaved person generated per year versus the cost of their maintenance, calculations proving that slavery was not a benevolent institution, but a ruthlessly profitable system of exploitation. Names and ages of everyone sold from Whitefield Manor over the past 4 years, with notes on which families had been separated, which children had been taken from mothers, which elderly slaves had been worked until they died. And, most damning of all, copies of letters Solomon had been writing to abolitionist newspapers in Philadelphia and Boston. Letters he could never be able to send because he had no access to mail without supervision. Letters that analyzed slavery's economics with mathematical precision, proving through numbers what activists had been arguing through morality. "Do you understand, Solomon?" Whitefield said slowly, each word measured, "what would happen if this reached the wrong people?" "Yes, sir." "Do you understand what this makes you?" "Yes, sir." Whitefield's hand moved fast. The backhand struck Solomon's face with enough force to snap his head sideways. Blood filled his mouth. He tasted copper, felt a tooth come loose. "You ungrateful piece of property." Whitefield's voice was shaking. "I gave you education. I gave you position. I treated you better than any slave in Maryland, and this is how you repay me?" Solomon straightened. He met Whitefield's eyes. "You gave me nothing, sir. Mr. Harper educated me. You profited from it." The second blow knocked Solomon to the floor. Benjamin and Graves grabbed him, hauled him upright. Whitefield was breathing hard, rage breaking through the careful control he usually maintained. "Take him to the barn," Whitefield ordered. "I want everyone on this plantation to see what happens to slaves who forget their place." They dragged Solomon across the yard. It was mid-morning, and the enslaved population was at work, in the fields, in the smokehouse, in the laundry. Whitefield had one of the overseers ring the bell, the signal that everyone was to stop working and assemble. 200 people gathered in front of the barn. Solomon was forced to his knees. Thomas Graves retrieved the whip. "This man has been keeping forbidden records. He has been writing letters to abolitionists. He has betrayed my trust and endangered everyone on this plantation." The first lash opened Solomon's shirt and the skin beneath it. The second drew blood. By the 5th, Solomon had stopped counting. By the 10th, his vision was blurring. By the 20th, he had retreated into the part of his mind where numbers lived, the place Whitefield could not reach with violence. He calculated the angle of each blow, the approximate force, the amount of tissue damage. He turned his own suffering into mathematical problems, solving them one by one, maintaining the only control he had left. When they finally stopped, Solomon could not stand. They left him there, bleeding in the dirt, as a lesson to the others.
Joseph came after dark when the overseers had gone to their quarters. He carried Solomon back to the slave quarters, laid him on a pallet, cleaned the wounds as best he could. "You should have hidden them better," Joseph whispered. "I wanted them to be found," Solomon replied through swollen lips. "Eventually, by the right people. You could have died. I know." Solomon survived, his back healed into thick scars that would never fully fade. But something else had changed. Charles Whitfield no longer trusted him, no longer saw him as a useful asset. An educated slave who resented his bondage was not an asset, he was a liability. Whitfield made his decision in early April. Solomon would be sold, but not to another plantation owner who might find his skills valuable, not to anyone who might allow him to continue using his mathematical abilities. Whitfield would ensure that Solomon's intelligence became worthless. He would sell Solomon as damaged goods, sell him for an insulting price, a humiliating price, a price that would ensure whoever bought him would treat him as replaceable labor, a price that would strip away any remaining dignity, any remaining value, any remaining hope. $9.
Rebecca Claiborne owned a boarding house on Lexington Street in Baltimore. It was a modest establishment, 3 stories, 10 rooms, catering mostly to traveling merchants and craftsmen. What the neighbors did not know, what even most of her boarders did not suspect, was that Rebecca's house served another purpose. It was a station on the Underground Railroad. When Rebecca brought Solomon to her boarding house that rainy April evening, she took him not to one of the regular guest rooms, but to a hidden space in the attic. A false wall concealed a room large enough for 6 people, with bedding, water, basic provisions. Solomon was not the first fugitive to hide here. He would not be the last. "You are safe," Rebecca told him. "Rest now. We will speak tomorrow." Solomon slept for 14 hours. When he woke, his body ached from the healing lash wounds. His eye was still swollen, but his mind was clear, clearer than it had been in months. He was no longer at Whitfield Manor. He was no longer property, at least not in any practical sense. Rebecca Claiborne had paid $15 for him, which meant legally she owned him, but Solomon understood that this was a technicality, a necessary legal fiction to remove him from Whitfield's control. Rebecca brought him food, cornbread, beans, salt pork, simple fare, but more than Solomon had eaten in the 3 weeks since his whipping. "Do you know who I am?" Rebecca asked. "No, ma'am. I am what they call a conductor. I help people reach freedom. But I am also something else. I work with people in Philadelphia and Boston who are gathering evidence against slavery, evidence that can be used to convince Northern politicians, Northern newspapers, Northern citizens that slavery is not the benign institution Southerners claim it is." Solomon listened. "Charles Whitfield sold you because he found journals you were keeping, journals that documented the true economics of slavery. I need to know, do you remember what you wrote?" "I remember all of it." Rebecca leaned forward. "All of it?" "Every number, every calculation, every name. Mr. Harper taught me memory techniques when I was young. I do not forget mathematics." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked, "Can you reproduce those journals? Everything Whitfield destroyed?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I have a proposition for you." Over the next 3 weeks, Rebecca explained the scope of what she was asking. The abolitionist movement had moral arguments, had testimonies from former slaves, had philosophical and religious justifications for ending slavery. What they did not have was comprehensive economic data, data that proved through numbers that Northern businessmen and politicians would find credible that slavery was not economically necessary, that slavery concentrated wealth in the hands of a few plantation owners, that it retarded Southern economic development by making free labor uncompetitive. They needed someone who could analyze slavery's economics from the inside, someone who had kept the books for a major plantation, someone who understood both the mathematics and the lived reality. They needed Solomon. "If you agree," Rebecca said. "You will stay here. You will work with 3 other people who are gathering similar information. You will write reports that will be published anonymously in northern newspapers. You will help us build a case that slavery is not just morally wrong, but economically irrational." "And if I refuse?" "Then I will help you reach Canada, where you will be legally free. You have already suffered enough. No one would blame you for choosing safety." Solomon thought about this for 3 days, thought about the risk of staying in Baltimore, where slave catchers operated openly and any black person could be seized and sent south, thought about the relative safety of Canada, where he could live quietly, build a new life, never face a whip again. But he also thought about the 200 people still enslaved at Whitfield Manor, thought about Dinah, his mother, who had died because her life was valued less than a horse's health, thought about Joseph, who had raised him and who was now 53 years old, his body breaking down from decades of labor, with no hope of freedom before death. Solomon made his choice. "I will stay. I will help." The work began immediately. Rebecca introduced Solomon to 3 other people: William, a free black man who worked as a clerk in Baltimore's customs house and who had access to shipping records showing the volume of slave-produced cotton and tobacco moving through the port; Hannah, a white woman married to a Quaker merchant who traveled frequently to southern ports and gathered information about slave prices, crop values, and plantation operations; and David, a former slave who had escaped from Virginia and who possessed a photographic memory similar to Solomon's. Together, they formed a network that gathered and analyzed information about slavery's economic infrastructure. Solomon's specific role was mathematical analysis. He took the raw data, shipping volumes, crop prices, slave auction records, plantation ledgers that David and Hannah acquired through various means, and transformed it into reports that could be published in newspapers. His first report, completed in May of 1851, analyzed the profitability of slavery in Maryland tobacco production. Using numbers from Whitfield Manor and 5 other plantations, Solomon proved that enslaved labor generated an average of $847 per worker per year, while costing only $73 to maintain. The profit margin was extraordinary, but Solomon went further. He calculated what would happen if plantation owners paid wages instead of owning workers. The conclusion was striking. Free labor would be cheaper in the long run because it would incentivize mechanization and efficiency improvements that slavery discouraged. Plantation owners who relied on enslaved labor had no reason to innovate because labor costs were artificially low and fixed. This meant Southern agriculture was technologically backward compared to Northern farming, which had adopted mechanical reapers and other innovations. The report was published anonymously in the Pennsylvania Freeman in June 1851 under the title "The False Economy of Forced Labor." It was reprinted in 7 other newspapers. Plantation owners in Maryland were furious but couldn't identify the source because the analysis used data from multiple plantations without naming them specifically. Solomon wrote 13 more reports over the next 2 years. Each one used different economic data to prove different aspects of slavery's inefficiency and moral bankruptcy. He wrote about the slave trade's impact on African populations, about the artificial suppression of wages for poor whites who could not compete with unpaid enslaved labor, about the concentration of wealth among large plantation owners and the resulting lack of economic opportunity for small farmers. His reports were dry, technical, filled with tables and calculations. They were also devastating, because numbers, as his mother had taught him, were truth that could not be changed with words. But in February 1853, something went wrong. Charles Whitfield received an anonymous letter in February 1853. The letter contained a copy of Solomon's report on Maryland tobacco production. Across the top, someone had written,
"Activity." Charles Whitfield did not bring Solomon back to Whitfield Manor. He sold him the next day in a private sale to a cotton plantation in Georgia. sold him for $850, a standard price for a healthy male slave, because Whitfield wanted to recoup the loss from the humiliating $9 auction. Solomon was transported south in chains, along with 12 other slaves purchased by the same Georgia plantation. The journey took 9 days by wagon and ship. They arrived in Atlanta on April 3, 1853. Solomon never saw Baltimore again. Solomon spent the remaining 12 years of slavery on Sattler Plantation in northern Georgia. He worked in the fields, cotton planting, weeding, harvesting. The education Charles Whitfield had exploited and feared became irrelevant. Solomon's mathematical genius, his ability to analyze and calculate and document, meant nothing to a cotton overseer who needed bodies to clear land and pick bowls. But Solomon continued to count. He counted the rows, the baskets, the pounds, the hours. He counted the number of people who died from overwork, from heat exhaustion, from infections that went untreated. He counted the children born into slavery, the families separated when economic necessity required sales, the bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the property. And he remembered. He remembered everything he had documented in Baltimore, every report he had written, every calculation he had made, every number that proved slavery's fundamental immorality and economic irrationality. When Union forces reached Georgia in 1865, when the plantation was abandoned and the enslaved population was freed, Solomon was 36 years old. His body was worn from 12 years of field labor. His back carried scars from multiple whippings. His hands were calloused. His eyesight was failing. His teeth were rotting from malnutrition. But his mind remained sharp. Solomon made his way to Atlanta, where the Freedmen's Bureau had established an office to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The Bureau was overwhelmed. Thousands of newly freed people needed housing, employment, education, legal assistance. The Bureau needed literate black men who could read, write, keep records, help process the massive administrative task of transforming 4 million enslaved people into citizens. Solomon became a clerk in the Atlanta Freedmen's Bureau office in June 1865. For the next 8 years, he worked to document what slavery had been. He took testimonies from hundreds of formerly enslaved people, recording their stories, their experiences, their losses. He created accounting records showing the economic value that had been extracted from enslaved labor without compensation. He wrote reports for the Bureau's Washington office, reports that used the same analytical approach he had developed in Baltimore. And in 1872, he reproduced from memory the 13 reports he had written 20 years earlier, reproduced them exactly, every number, every calculation, every conclusion. He had them published in a collected volume titled The Economics of Slavery, Mathematical Proof of a Moral Crime. The volume was not widely distributed. Reconstruction was collapsing. Northern political will to protect black rights in the South was fading. White supremacist organizations were using violence and intimidation to restore the racial hierarchy that slavery had enforced. Solomon's book was too controversial, too dangerous, too explicit in its proof that slavery had been a system of calculated economic exploitation. Most of the printed copies were destroyed. The few that survived were hidden in university libraries, filed away in collections that scholars would not rediscover for another century. Solomon died in 1883 at the age of 54. His death certificate listed the cause as consumption, tuberculosis, that likely began during his years of field labor in Georgia. He was buried in Atlanta's Black Cemetery
in a grave marked with a simple wooden cross that rotted away decades later. His story was forgotten.
In 1994, a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University named Michael Chen was researching abolitionist economic arguments for his dissertation. He found a reference in a footnote to a report published in the Pennsylvania Freeman in 1851 titled "The False Economy of Forced Labor." The reference intrigued him because the analysis described in the footnote was mathematically sophisticated, using statistical methods that seemed anachronistic for the 1850s. Chen tracked down the original newspaper on microfilm, read the report, was stunned by its precision and rigor, began searching for other reports by the same anonymous author. Over the next 3 years, Chen found all 13 reports Solomon had written, found Rebecca Claiborne's trial records, found the Freedmen's Bureau documents from Atlanta, and finally, in the archives of a small black church in Atlanta, Chen found a surviving copy of The Economics of Slavery, mathematical proof of a moral crime, published in 1772 by an author identified only as S. Freeman. The name was a pseudonym. Solomon had used it because Freeman represented what he had become, a free man, and what he believed all people deserved to be. Chen published his findings in 1997 in a book titled The Economic Abolitionist, Solomon Freeman and the Economic Critique of Slavery. The book won the Bancroft Prize, one of the most prestigious honors in American history. Solomon's story was recovered, his 13 reports were republished, his testimony to the Freedmen's Bureau was digitized and made available to researchers. His life became evidence of something that slavery's defenders had always denied, that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active, intelligent resistors who understood exactly what was being done to them and who fought back with every tool available. In 2015, the University of Maryland established the Solomon Freeman Scholarship for Mathematics and Social Justice. It provides full tuition for students studying the intersection of quantitative analysis and civil rights advocacy. The first recipient was a young black woman from Baltimore who wanted to use data science to document modern economic inequality. And in 2019, during the auction house's 200th anniversary, Camden Street Slave Market, now a museum, installed a permanent exhibit telling Solomon's story. At the center of the exhibit is a brass plaque mounted at the exact spot where Solomon stood on April 14, 1851. The plaque reads, "Here, a man worth everything was sold for $9. Here they tried to measure genius in coins. Here they failed."